Welcome, Gunrunner.
This video is brought to you by a compendium of Atari 2600 games Volume 1 by Kieran Hawken and AG Books. This full colour book features over 250 game reviews, fun facts and trivia, personal stories, and is the ultimate companion to Atari's iconic console. It is available in both hardback and paperback and can be purchased worldwide from all leading bookstores including Amazon, W.H. Smith's, Waterstones, Barnes & Noble and Wordery. So what are you waiting for? Get your copy today! The Atari 2600 is one of the greatest consoles of all time. First released in 1977, it took the world by storm and in turn created what we know as the highly lucrative video game industry of today. From the iconic wood grain of the first model to the futuristic silver strip of the last, the VCS, as it was originally known, had the longest life of any video games console ever, an incredible 15 years. There really is no understating the impact of this console and the games that people played on it. From the very first game to sell 1 million copies, the legendary Space Invaders, to the very first licensed sports title in Pelé Soccer, the catalogue is full of timeless classics that are still enjoyed by people to this very day. The system remains as popular as it ever was with collectors thanks to the widespread availability of real hardware, but also through the ease of emulation and the more recent range of plug-and-play flashback consoles, which even includes a handheld too. The 2600 is also receiving new games on pretty much a monthly basis thanks to the creativity and passion of the homebrew community, meaning that Atari's iconic creation will live on for many years to come. The unbelievably long life of the 2600 saw a dramatic evolution in its games library, with early games clocking in at a measly 2 kilobytes and later games using up a whopping 32K of ROM. There are few, if any, systems that show such a huge jump in capabilities. These larger cartridges, as well as the discovery of new programming techniques and more advanced development kits, helped programmers push the 2600 to its absolute limits, and well beyond what any of the original designers thought was possible. This video chronicles that evolution, showing you some of the system's earliest games compared side by side with titles from much later in the console's life. In the interests of fairness, I have only compared games that use the same gameplay style or are evolutions of the exact same title. There are a total of 15 such comparisons, and all the games were released commercially within the 2600's original lifetime. So let's get on with the show and take a look at the amazing evolution of the Atari 2600.
The fun is back! Oh yes, siree! It's the 2600 from Atari. It's the video system with classics galore, from Space Invaders to cars that roar. A real hip joystick controls the screen. Solaris is hot and Midnight Magic's mean. And one more thing, it's got a special low price, under 50 bucks. 50 bucks? Now isn't that nice? The fun is back! Oh yes, siree! It's the 2600 from Atari.
Let's start off with one of the 2600's most iconic games, shall we? Warren Robinette's Adventure is widely credited as being the very first top-down RPG and inspired a whole new genre of games that are still as popular as ever. Beyond its crude graphics and sound was a deep and fulfilling game that lit up your imagination. 9 years later came Secret Quest. Designed by Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell and coded by Steve DeFrisco, the game was intended to be the 2600's answer to Zelda. With its huge map, outstanding high-res graphics, in-game music and clever password system, it's hard to believe it's being played on the same hardware. One of the earliest sports games created by Atari, basketball was famously featured in the classic Leslie Nielsen movie Airplane, where it was being played in the cockpit by none other than NBA Hall of Famer Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. With just 2 players, a lack of proper rules, and even a square ball, it was a far cry from the real thing, but proved pretty popular nonetheless. But over 10 years later, Double Dunk arrived on the scene and showed how it really should be done on the video computer system. With 2 players on each team, a huge selection of options, musical intro sequence, and true-to-life rules, it remains one of the very best sports simulations available for the Atari 2600. a conversion of the 1976 arcade game of the same name, the 2600 port of Night Driver was put together by legendary programmer Rob Fulop of Imagic and Night Trap fame. The original coin-op was a simple black and white affair where the car was an off-screen overlay and the road was nothing more than 2 lines of blocks. The VCS version did improve on this somewhat by adding colour, scenery and actual cars, but it was still pretty basic. One of the very last commercial games released for the 2600, Fatal Run can be more of an evolution within the driving genre. It features full colour high-res graphics including cutscenes, multiple levels, an upgrade system and even a password feature to carry on where you left off. It also remains the largest commercial Atari 2600 cartridge ever with its massive 32K of ROM. Another coin-op conversion, Outlaw was notable at the time for numerous reasons. Programmed by the amazingly talented David Pitfall Crane, the game's huge sprites wowed audiences at the time and allowed him to master some clever coding tricks that would later be used in many of his Activision games. Although Commando isn't strictly the same genre, being vertically scrolling for a start, it does still feature the same old shoot the other man to survive trope, and there are some basic gameplay similarities too. Okay, I might be stretching things somewhat, but this conversion of the classic Capcom arcade game is one that I really wanted to include, and fits into the same boat as other arcade conversions you never thought were possible on the 2600, like Akari Warriors, Double Dragon, Xenophobe, Kung Fu Master and Rampage. From one game programmed by an Activision co-founder to another with Bob Whitehead's Football. This early 2600 sports title was referred to internally as Frog Football because of the strange look of the sprites. It would be pretty hard to find a more simple representation of Gridiron anywhere, and it's hardly surprising to learn that it was one of the very first 2600 titles to be discontinued by Atari. Some 10 years later, Star Raiders programmer and creator of the Pokey Chip, Doug Neubauer, would have another go at the genre with Super Football, and deliver a full 3D representation of the sport that nobody thought was possible. It not only looks amazing, it plays great too, and is probably the most realistic sports simulation you're going to find on the console. You knew this one was going to be here, right? Todd Fry's port of the iconic Namco arcade game has gone down in history as one of the worst ports ever, and a key part of Warner Atari's demise. There's been much discussion over the years about what happened to make it so bad, including the ROM size allocated and intentional design choices like the flickering ghosts. So we don't need to go over all of that again. You just need to take one look at the video to know that it fell short. What a difference a year makes though, because Ms. Pac-Man couldn't be more of a different story. In fact, out of all the games featured in this video, there are none with such a small time gap between them. The Atari 2600 port of Ms. Pac-Man got everything right that its predecessor got wrong. I could have also included the third game too, in Junior Pac-Man with its scrolling mazes, but I feel that Ms. Pac-Man represents such a huge leap in such a small amount of time that I had to include it. Pinball games have been a mainstay of home systems over the years, going right back to Atari's own standalone video pinball console and Video Whiz Ball on the Fairchild Channel F. Atari chose to take the game to the 2600 too in 1980, and it was a reasonable attempt that was only spoiled somewhat by the irregular shape of the table that left the flippers feeling rather redundant for long periods of time. However, as fun as video pinball was, it was superseded in every way with the 1986 release of Midnight Magic. Although this one was billed as a port of the popular Apple II and Atari 8-bit game of the same name, it's actually a brand new table designed specifically for the Atari 2600. The high-res visuals look terrific, the ball movement is spot on, and it plays like a dream. There are quite a few pinball games on the VCS, but Midnight Magic bests them all. Part of Activision's debut games lineup, Bob Whitehead's boxing proved a big hit with gamers everywhere, and there is absolutely no doubt in the fun that can be had with it. But there is a lot of doubt when it comes to the game's realism, as boxing is a far cry from the real sport in both the way it looks and the way it plays. The last entry in Atari's Real Sports series, which was actually created to correct many of the criticisms associated with the 2600's original sports-based titles, Real Sports Boxing really does look the part with its large multicoloured sprites, 3D perspective and animated crowd. It also sounds the part too with its realistic crowd noises. Programmer Alex DeMeo later repurposed this game to create title match pro wrestling for absolute entertainment. Both come highly recommended. One of Atari's most famous games ever, the original Breakout arcade game was actually engineered by Apple co-founders Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. The 2600 port was expertly done and not only replicated the original gameplay perfectly, but also added a host of extra modes and gameplay options that improved it massively. But by 1989, the bat and ball genre had come a very long way and been revolutionised by the 1986 release of Taito's Arkanoid. Atari decided it was time to have another go and turned to Nolan Bushnell's Axlon to provide the goods. Off the Wall brings Breakout right up to date with multicolour visuals, animated enemies and awesome power-ups. The only negative aspect was that you had to use the joystick instead of the paddles. I really wish they had provided a choice. Part of the then Video Computer System's original launch lineup, Indy 500 was a port of the Atari arcade game Indy 800, which itself was a spin-off from the popular Sprint series. It came bundled with the criminally underutilised driver controllers and featured just one track, no computer opponents and some incredibly basic visuals. Indy 500 was a far cry from the real thing. After the hugely successful 1986 release of Super Sprint in the arcades, Atari Corporation suddenly remembered that it was in fact them that owned the Sprint franchise and not their arcade cousins. So they hired experienced Atari programmer Bob Polaro to have a go at replicating the game on the 2600. The result was Sprint Master, a masterful update of the original Sprint game that contains many of the features that made Super Sprint so great, including computer-controlled rivals, car upgrades, a selection of different tracks, and even different road surfaces. When people choose to mock the Atari 2600, golf is often one of the games they like to bring up, possibly because of the simplistic graphics and sound, but mostly down to the absolutely bizarre control method that you'll struggle to make any sense of, even after reading the manual. It's fair to say that golf is an extremely rough approximation of the sport. Despite golf-based games always proving popular, it took 10 years for somebody else to have a go and correct the wrongs of Atari's early title. Thankfully, in the twilight years of the 2600, veteran Atari programmer David Lubar came up with the goods in the form of My Golf, a PAL exclusive that was the only original game put out by Australian publishers HES. A startling technical achievement, My Golf boasts 18 multi-screen holes, club selection, course hazards, an animated golfer, and a separate putting screen amongst many other impressive features. Coleco's port of the hugely popular Sega arcade game Zaxxon was released to a flurry of criticism back in 1982. The classic coin-op was known for its revolutionary isometric visuals and use of 3D perspective, so the heavily adapted behind-the-ship view in this version made it feel like a completely different game. Coleco famously claimed that the isometric graphics associated with the game were impossible to recreate on the Atari 2600. They were later shown to be wrong. It might have taken 5 years, but Bob Polaro proved Coleco's incompetence with his conversion of Desert Falcon from the Atari 7800. This was perhaps made even more impressive when you consider that the original was somewhat of a showcase title for the Pro system. OK, Desert Falcon is a little bit clunky, and it's hard to judge your height, but it's a damn sight better effort than Zaxxon was. In many ways, Bob Whitehead did a good job at simplifying America's favourite pastime, the Atari 2600, taking baseball down to its most basic elements without removing any of the fun. But technically impressive it was not, and it certainly wasn't surprising to see the sport replicated with much more accuracy in the following years. By far the best of these later baseball games was Pete Rose Baseball by Absolute Entertainment. Sports game specialist Alex DeMeo is back on this list again, with a game that does everything a home run couldn't. We have realistic pitching and batting, separate screens for fielding, intelligent computer-controlled opposition, and terrific graphics and sound. Add the name of a Baseball Hall of Famer into the mix and you have a complete package. Like Pac-Man, Defender is another arcade conversion that very much failed to deliver on the Atari 2600, with its substantially altered design and many technical misgivings. It might surprise you to learn that Bob Polaro programmed this port, given his otherwise excellent reputation, and I'm sure he counts this as one of the lowest points in his career. For me, VCS Defender is almost unplayable, mainly down to the disappearing ship. Thankfully, Atari had another go at the game 2 years later when they converted the sequel Stargate, which was later re-released as Defender 2. This is a much better representation of the Williams Electronics arcade game. In fact, I'd argue that this is actually the best coin-up conversion on the 2600 full stop. The high-res graphics look amazing, the audio is almost perfect, and the fast-paced gameplay remains intact. Quite simply one of the finest games released for the system and a coding masterclass. A launch game for the video computer system, Bob Whitehead's Starship was a conversion of the Atari arcade game of the same name, and regarded as one of the most interesting titles from that original lineup. With its 3D viewpoint and varied game modes, it offered something very different to the more simple 2D titles, but would soon be surpassed rather dramatically. The amazingly talented Doug Neubauer created the revolutionary Star Raiders for the Atari 8-bit back in 1979, and a more than competent VCS port of the game by Carlo Moninsky appeared in 1982 that blew Starship out of the water. But Doug wasn't done with his 3D space shooter fix, and in 1986 he delivered Solaris, which was originally intended to be a game based on the cult movie The Last Starfighter. Of all the games released to the Atari 2600 in its 15-year commercial lifetime, there are none more impressive than Solaris. The video here very much speaks for itself. Not only is it a graphical and audible tour de force, it's still my favourite game to play on this system too.
Out here we entertain ourselves at home, so we got an Atari video game. There's so many different games to play. We especially like Space Invaders, zapping those little devils from outer space. It's fun, but personally I think the whole idea of creatures from outer space is a little far-fetched.
No other company offers you as many different video game cartridges as Atari.
And there we have it, the evolution of Atari's best-selling 2600 console during its 15-year commercial life. I think you'll agree that most of these comparisons are pretty startling, and it's incredible to see what programmers managed to achieve later in the system's life. But what do you think? Are there any other good comparisons you can think of that I didn't include? And would you like me to do a follow-up that compares some of the modern homebrew games with original titles like the remake of Donkey Kong, 8K Pac-Man and Asteroids Arcade? Please let me know in the comments. But before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Mitchell Valentino, James Taylor, Neptune, Chaotic, Seth Robinson, Carl Olsen, Dos Gamerman, Tiago Piero dos Santos Silva and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to a host of extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.